Born in 1967, Mindy Sue Drury grew up in Hendersonville, Tennessee.
Mindy's dad, he was a mechanic. He worked at a gas station, and I was a stay-at-home mom.
And for the first few years of her life, Mindy was a happy, carefree child.
She stayed outside all the time, her and some neighbor girls, and they'd play outside and everything.
But soon after Mindy started elementary school, her life took a dramatic turn. Her parents divorced, and her mother went from a stay-at-home mom to a struggling single one.
I went to work after I left my first husband.
Mindy's mother wouldn't be single for long, though. When Mindy was 6, her mother met a man named Henry Sherman Dodd. Betty met Henry when she took a late-night waitressing job at a Nashville restaurant.
It used to be called the Pancake House, and had a lounge upstairs, and it was the upstairs lounge. The restaurant was open 24 hours a day.
And once they met, it wasn't long before the charming Henry had convinced Betty to go out with him.
He could talk and make you believe he was the President of the United States.
The truth was a little more humble, though.
Mr. Dodd had a painting and wallpaper business,
Which meant that after they got married in 1974, Betty Dodd kept her waitressing job in order to get by.
To keep from having to pay a babysitter, he worked during the day and I worked at night.
It wasn't an easy life, but it appeared to work.
everybody thought of him as, like a really good man, helping people. That's what they know him for.
And the fact that he and Betty soon had a son of their own didn't stop him from being especially devoted to Mindy.
I just thought he was a loving, devoted stepfather.
And by the time she was in high school, Mindy had grown into a bubbly, outgoing teen.
She was very friendly with everyone. She could make conversation with just about anybody. And she could talk about anything. She could just pop out with anything.
Including, at the end of 1985, 2 words no mother wants to hear from her teenage daughter. I'm pregnant.
I didn't know who Mindy had gotten pregnant with. She said it was some boy she met.
According to Mindy, the father was no longer in the picture, but she decided to keep the baby, giving birth to a little girl in July of 1986.
When Mindy was about 18, she had Angel.
Mindy had managed to finish high school before the baby was born, but she remained close to her mother and Henry. In fact, she continued to live with them for her daughter's sake.
Me and Mindy, we both took care of her, and we would fight over who was going to feed her and this and that.
And while Betty helped with the baby, Mindy helped pay the bills.
She was working at Kroger's in the bakery, decorating cakes.
The family needed the help, too. Almost 20 years after he married Mindy's mother, Henry was having a hard time finding painting jobs.
He said, I can't find one that pays me what I want. Half the time he would quit a job and sit at home.
Sometimes he did more than sit.
He drank, not all the time.
And by 1992, Betty and Henry's marriage was clearly in trouble.
I would not get any sleep because he would keep me awake all night, just arguing with me.
But then, just when Betty figured things couldn't get any worse, Henry landed the knockout blow. During a drunken argument, he let slip a devastating secret. Mindy's little girl, Betty's granddaughter, was his.
I was shocked. I was beyond hurt.
And then Henry told Betty that he was in love with Mindy, now 25.
Didn't faze me. I was so numb.
Numb or not, Betty and Henry divorced, but she initially remained close to her daughter and her ex-husband.
We lived in the same apartments. I lived upstairs. They lived downstairs.
And in 1993, Mindy and Henry got married, despite a 15-year difference in their ages and the very unusual nature of their relationship.
The family dynamic is really odd here. Before Mindy and Mr. Dodd were married, Mr. Dodd was actually Mindy's stepfather.
His stepdaughter, in essence, became his wife.
Soon after the wedding, Mindy gave birth to a son, but the family didn't exactly settle down.
Lived in Cottontown first in a trailer, and then we moved to Hendersonville.
He was forever moving because he would get behind in the rent.
As always, Mindy helped out when she could, working a series of part-time jobs.
She worked at McDonald's as a swing manager, and then after that she worked at Walmart in customer service.
But the family really didn't get on its feet until the late 90s, when Mindy, Henry, and the kids moved to Smyrna.
When the Dodd family arrived in Smyrna, it was just taking off. It's gone from about 10,000 people to about 40,000 people. Also gone from quite a bit of a small town to a big suburb.
And Henry ended up painting quite a few of those new houses.
It was always houses that he painted, the new subdivisions, and he would get contracts with the builders.
In fact, Henry's painting business was doing so well that the family was even able to rent a home of their own.
It was nice. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath.
It was kind of a quiet, really nice, quiet neighborhood.
It had taken almost 6 years to do it, but it looked as if Mindy and her husband had finally overcome their bizarre beginnings and settled into a quiet, respectable life together. On the surface, one that appeared no different from thousands of other hardworking families in Smyrna.
It's very conservative. It is in the Bible Belt.
But something was about to happen that would expose all the couple's unsavory secrets, and then some. On December 31st, Henry Sherman Dodd suddenly disappeared. Mindy's daughter, then 13, says she was at a friend's house when she got a call from her mother at around 1 o'clock that afternoon.
She's crying, saying that Daddy never came home.
Mindy told her daughter to come home, and then she called the police.
My husband never came home last night.
Mindy told the dispatcher she'd last seen Henry the night before, shortly before she left for the graveyard shift at Walmart.
He left to go pick my nephew up at work. And he never showed up there.
And according to Mindy, she had no idea where her husband had gone.
He still wasn't home when I got home. Okay, did you file a report yet? No, ma'am, that's what I'm calling to do. Okay, I'm just kind of worried. Okay, it's not like him to do that.
It was New Year's Eve, 1999, in the quiet Nashville suburb of Smyrna, Tennessee. And 32-year-old Mindy Dodd was looking for her husband, Henry Sherman Dodd. The 47-year-old house painter had disappeared the night before.
Her reports were that she had not heard from him since 11 o'clock on December 3rd.
But then, just a few hours after Mindy called the authorities, Henry's adult son had also called 911 and reported that he'd just spotted his father's truck in a shopping center parking lot while driving to the bank.
He stopped to investigate it and saw that Mr. Dodd was slumped over in the vehicle, at which point he called 911.
And when officers arrived on the scene, they confirmed it.
Mr. Dodd had, in fact, been shot to death.
But who would want to kill Henry, and why? When he called 911, Henry's son did say there was some sort of trouble between his father and his wife, Mindy.
Him and his wife have a problem.
Just what sort of problems Henry's son hadn't said. And before they could ask him to elaborate, another player entered the picture, James Smallwood.
Mr. Smallwood actually showed up to the crime scene.
James was Henry's nephew.
He had been living with him off and on.
The down-on-his-luck 23-year-old had moved in with the family 3 months earlier.
He used my father for a place to live.
Not that Henry was one to be taken advantage of easily.
Mr. Dodd expected him to work, was wanting him to pay his own way.
He was helping his uncle paint and wallpaper and everything.
And like Mindy, James also brought in a little extra money with a part-time job.
He was working at the Hardee's restaurant there in Smyrna.
In fact, according to what Mindy told the police when she reported her husband missing, that's where Henry had been going when he disappeared.
She conveyed how he was supposed to pick up Mr. Smallwood at Hardee's that night from work, didn't pick him up, that she then went and picked him up and brought him home.
And now, only a few hours after Henry had failed to pick him up, James had suddenly showed up at the location where his uncle had been found murdered.
The police became suspicious.
According to James, a friend had called him after spotting his uncle's truck and the police cars in the parking lot. However, once the officers at the scene informed James that his uncle was dead, he made what they felt was an odd request.
He wanted to make sure he was the one that would notify Mindy Dodd of the death. That was most bizarre to us. What's he need this task for?
Unsure just what to make of James's request, the investigators asked that he come back to the office with them so they could take his statement.
Once we got to the police department, of course, the family started showing up, and one of the family members that showed up was, of course, Mindy Dodd.
And once she arrived, the investigators asked to speak to her privately.
Because of the emotions of the situation, we wanted to separate her from the family.
But before the investigators ushered her into a back room, Mindy made an unusual request of her own.
Miss Dodd actually asked for Mr. Smallwood to accompany her.
And it didn't appear to be for emotional support.
Mr. Smallwood was very emotional. Miss Dodd was not emotional at all.
Mr. Smallwood, the one that was crying quite a bit.
But why would James be so much more upset than Mindy? Unsure just what was going on, the police placed each of them in separate interview rooms, and then they questioned James first.
After the police became suspicious, they decided that it was a good time to conduct an interview.
In his interview, James started out by speaking very highly of Henry.
He's done more for me than anybody, man. And you're talking about Mr. Don? Yeah.
And when asked about Henry's disappearance, all James said he knew was that Henry was supposed to pick him up the night before.
I work in clothes.
But according to James, Henry had never showed, so he had called Mindy at work and begged her for a ride home.
She called out over 30 minutes, take me home. What did she do afterwards? Then she went back to work.
Next, the questions turned to Mindy and Henry's relationship, including the fact that Mindy had once been Henry's stepdaughter.
They're married. Yeah, but Mindy was his daughter. Yeah. Okay. Used to be. Okay, just want to make sure I got everything down pat here.
The backstory on the family was very unusual, just very intertwined. The relationships were very, very unusual relationships.
Although just how intertwined and unusual, the investigators had no idea. James told the investigators that after 7 years together, Mindy and Henry's relationship had grown stale.
The marriage just was going downhill. They were staying together for the kids.
Although according to James, Henry had tried to spice things up sexually.
He persuaded me and Mindy into having a threesome with him.
There was actually a sexual triangle between the three of them.
Would he take pictures of video or anything like that? No, nothing like that. It was basically, just oral sex and like watch me do her.
And when the investigators asked whether Henry ever did more than watch,
Did he ever touch you in any way?
James said yes.
Honestly, it really didn't. It really didn't faze me.
All three individuals would participate in whatever sexual game or event that they were having, whether it was between Mr. Smallwood and Mr. Dodd or between Mr. Smallwood and Miss Dodd.
And once James had explained the situation, the investigators figured they knew what happened.
Did you start enjoying the threesome with Mindy? Another night, yeah.
And according to James, Mindy felt the same way about him.
Did Mindy enjoy you and her relationship together? Yeah. Did she ever tell you she did? Yeah.
Had the investigators uncovered a motive for murder?
Mr. Smallwood, I believe at the time, thought that he may be taking the place of her husband after he was gone.
There was one small complication, however. According to James, Mindy was also seeing someone else.
She apparently had a romantic involvement with a coworker at work.
All I know is that her and Robert had been having this thing going.
He had expressed a desire to marry her if she would leave her husband.
Do you think Robert had anything to do with this? I don't know.
Or did he? By then, the investigators were convinced that James knew more about his uncle's death than he let on. And to nudge him into revealing more, they led him to believe that in the next interrogation room, Mindy was busy naming him as her husband's murderer.
Here's being pointed out, okay, right now. And get to the being pointed out really sharp at. Me?
It wasn't entirely untrue. The police were already talking to Mindy.
We were at the same time doing just a very brief interview with Miss Dodd to try to get the timeline.
But James didn't know that was all the police were asking her, which gave them some useful leverage.
I want the truth. I don't want any more of these bullcrap lies. Okay, I want to shoot you straight, okay?
Would the idea that Mindy was selling him out be enough to crack James?
But then I got no proof. When did they tell what's up? I'll tell you what's up, and well, y'all at least get this in tape with her saying that she had part of it.
James finally began crying and stated that he had killed Mr. Dodd.
He said then that Mindy Dodd asked him to do it.
Mindy was saying she's tired of it, she can't do it anymore.
And when James said yes, Mindy had put a plan in motion.
Mindy Dodd gave him the gun that was actually the victim's gun that had been kept in the closet.
Then, on the night of December 30th,
What happened that evening is Mr. Smallwood called Mr. Dodd to pick him up from the restaurant that he worked at. Mr. Dodd picks him up at the restaurant and they go back to their home.
and once they pulled into the driveway,
He just pulled the gun out and then shot Mr. Dodd.
I shot him in the head, and then I shot him in his chest.
James said that once he'd shot Henry, he slid the body over and slipped behind the wheel of his uncle's truck.
And started driving around Smyrna trying to think of a place to get rid of the body.
But there was one tiny complication. Henry wasn't dead.
I heard him, and he was gurgling. And I took the gun, and I just pop, 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 pop.
Mr. Smallwood again shot him a couple more times in the back.
Then, once Henry was definitely dead, James said he had parked the truck, tossed the keys and gun into a dumpster, and called Mindy.
Mindy's first statement to him was, "Is it done?" And that's where Smallwood responded, "Yes." And Mindy responds, "Finally."
On the evening of December 31st, 1999, police in Smyrna, Tennessee were investigating the murder of Mindy Dodd's husband, Henry Sherman Dodd. The 47-year-old painter had been found dead in his pickup truck earlier that afternoon.
It looked like somebody had actually drove him there and planted that scene or planted that truck there with him in it.
And by that evening, the authorities had identified that somebody, Henry's nephew, James Smallwood. The 23-year-old had just confessed to killing Henry at Mindy's request.
They decided the way to deal with their situation and end their problems with Mr. Dodd was to eliminate him.
And if James's statement was true, the situation he and Mindy were in was almost too disturbing to contemplate.
Mr. Dodd forced Mindy and Mr. Smallwood to engage in sexual acts with him and with each other.
And according to James, when Mindy had approached him about killing Henry, he had agreed to help.
It did appear that Smallwood may have had a crush on her.
Although considering James's statement that Mindy had also been sleeping with a coworker, the investigators wondered, did Mindy have similar feelings for James, or was she simply using him?
Everybody in the relationship was deceiving the other. Mr. Smallwood was thinking, I'm going to be the romantic person in the life of Mindy Dodd, while Mindy Dodd is thinking, I'm going to be involved with the coworker at Walmart.
Although no matter who ended up with Mindy, James's statement clearly implicated her as the mastermind behind her husband's murder.
So that's when we confronted Mindy Dodd.
Not that they came right out and asked whether she put James up to killing her husband. Instead, when the investigators stepped into the interrogation room, they led Mindy to believe that the interview was routine, simply for the purpose of gathering information.
I just need to start at the beginning. How were you notified that what had happened to him?
At first, Mindy denied knowing anything about the murder. All she knew was that Henry hadn't picked up James at work the night before.
About 12:30, I got a phone call, and it was James. He said, asked me could I come pick him up. He said he tried to call the house, and there was no answer.
Miss Dodd had a very calm demeanor, not very much emotion. Very talkative. Almost in a sense where she was talking about everything except for the death of her husband of 6 years and the father of her children.
And when the investigators started asking Mindy about her and Henry's sex life, she was surprisingly nonchalant about that, too.
Okay, he had a problem of getting me, or keeping that way. And so therefore, I really didn't want to do it that much. You know? And he also got turned on to the thought of me being somebody new. Because he's my husband and I want to make my husband happy. I did some things that I'm not, you know. Like, there's another guy.
But Mindy claimed Henry had eventually become jealous, despite the fact that it had been his idea to bring someone else into the relationship.
Sometimes I keep arguing that if he wasn't around, that I'd probably find somebody that I love and probably screw the hell out of him all the time.
And according to Mindy, Henry wasn't about to let that happen.
He threatened to kill me if he ever found out that I was with somebody.
Mindy said she had taken her husband's threat seriously.
He threatened my life as far as I was concerned. I wanted to go to his life. I was afraid to.
However, Mindy also said she hadn't kept her husband's threat entirely to herself.
I told James that.
And how did James respond?
He had said, he said nobody threatened me, nobody killed me. He said basically that she needed to kill because he's not going to kill me. He's toxic to her.
Mindy said she hadn't believed James.
James is a talkative person. He says things, but he doesn't always hold to them.
And she certainly hadn't mentioned James's threat to her husband.
So I was afraid that he would kill James, or me, if I told him. I was afraid he would kill me. And I honestly believe that he knew.
In fact, Mindy said she had been so sure that James was bluffing that she had almost teased him about it when she called him at work on the evening of December 30th.
I asked him, I said, are you still going to go through with it? And he said, yeah. I said, what you were talking about? He was talking about he was going to do it. I said, yeah, he was going to do it.
Not that Mindy believed him, according to what she told the investigators.
I was just not going to do it. He's just bluffing, throwing out his mouth like y'all are. Sometimes people joke around about stuff they're not supposed to joke around with.
But as it turned out, James hadn't been joking.
People in the closet and buy it out. Did you tell him what to do? I didn't really take him to the closet. everybody in the family knew where that gun was. Everybody did. So, I mean, my mom didn't have to get the gun.
And according to Mindy, she had no idea he was really going to shoot Henry.
She really said she had nothing to do with it.
In fact, Mindy said she had been surprised when James called her up and asked her for a ride home after killing Henry and ditching his truck.
I said, oh my God.
And according to Mindy, she was still in shock when she picked James up a few minutes later.
I said, oh my God, you didn't. What was it? He started getting hysterical and said, I thought you wanted me dead. I said, David, I just didn't think you would do it. Because I seriously didn't think you would do it.
Her only reason for saying that was, I didn't think he was serious.
Do you think that you had a heart you had when you did? Honestly, I really had no control over it.
But if that was the case, why did she call the sheriff's department the next morning and report Henry missing, knowing full well that her husband was dead?
She had made so many false statements that she had no knowledge where he was at.
According to Mindy, it was simple. She had been afraid of James.
I was afraid if he did do that, I was afraid he was going to do the same thing to me.
The investigators weren't quite convinced, though. For one thing, Mindy still didn't seem all that broken up about her husband's death.
I don't remember Miss Dodd ever expressing remorse.
In fact, she admitted that, at least on some level, she'd had the opposite reaction to Henry's death.
Did you feel good? Did you feel relieved? I was in this station. How do you feel?
And unfortunately for Mindy, there was one more shock coming. At the end of her statement, the Smyrna police placed her under arrest for first-degree murder.
She basically confirmed what Mr. Smallwood said.
And since he had confessed to shooting Henry, the investigators also booked James for first-degree murder.
By midnight of that same day, both Mindy Dodd and James Smallwood had been arrested and placed in custody.
On September 25, 2001, Mindy Dodd stood trial for murder at the Rutherford County Courthouse in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The 34-year-old faced murder and conspiracy charges stemming from the December 1999 death of her husband, Henry Sherman Dodd, at the hands of his nephew, James Smallwood.
Mr. Smallwood said that he was asked to kill Mr. Dodd by Mindy Dodd.
James wasn't just Mindy's nephew by marriage, though. He was also her lover. Part of a three-way relationship involving Mindy, James, and Henry.
There was a lot of inappropriate sexual conduct going on.
The details of which had caused quite a stir in Mindy's hometown of Smyrna.
Considering that we're in the Bible Belt, the facts of this case were going to be not just odd, but extremely odd.
But as sensational as those salacious details were, when it came time to deliver his opening statement, the prosecutor asked the jury to look beyond them to see the real issue at stake.
That the real point of the case was the fact that we had a murder conspiracy going on.
And the prosecutors had what they believed to be powerful evidence of that conspiracy, starting with James's videotaped confession.
The strongest piece of evidence against Mindy Dodd was James Smallwood.
Not only had James confessed to shooting Henry, after his arrest, he'd led police to the murder weapon.
He told us where he had dumped that, the gun, the ammunition and stuff. We sent detectives over there to that to locate those.
We definitely had more physical evidence to tie James Smallwood to what he had done and more circumstantial evidence as far as the Mindy Dodd side of it, but still at the same time, I feel we have an overwhelming great case.
Starting with testimony from the man who'd actually pulled the trigger, James Smallwood.
We agreed that as part of his plea agreement, he would plead to conspiracy to commit murder. He would have a sentence of life with parole.
Mindy, on the other hand, rejected all attempts to negotiate a plea.
Mindy rejected the plea bargain because it wasn't true and she wasn't going to say she done something that she didn't do.
In its opening statement, the defense stood by Mindy's claim of innocence, arguing that she had never intended for James to kill her husband.
This was something that Mr. Smallwood had done on his own.
And when the prosecution started laying out its case and called James to the stand, he certainly sounded as if he had plenty of reasons to want his uncle dead.
Mr. Smallwood had reported that he had been sexually abused early in his childhood by Mr. Dodd.
The whole family dynamic started coming out the more we got into court.
However, according to James, his long history of abuse by Henry wasn't the reason he killed his uncle.
What James Smallwood testified to at trial was that Mindy Dodd was the person who was behind this whole thing.
The prosecution really stressed that Mindy and James Smallwood talked about the murder before it happened.
James also testified that Mindy had provided him with the means to kill her husband.
She was the one who supplied the firearm.
And then, after her husband was dead,
She asked, "Is it done?" And he says yes. That was very important. And in her interview, she did acknowledge that she did call him.
I asked him, I said, is it done? He said, oh man, did he kill her? Is that it? Yeah. And what did he say? He says, yes, it's done.
on cross, however, the defense questioned the accuracy of James's statement, starting with his claim that Mindy had given him her husband's gun.
The fact that Mindy knew that there was a gun in the closet doesn't necessarily mean that she gave the gun to James Smallwood.
And when it was the defense's turn to open their case, they started with Mindy's claim that she had never taken James's talk of killing Henry seriously.
In their opening statement, the defense said, yeah, Mindy and James Smallwood did talk about the murder from time to time. However, it really didn't matter because James was known as a blowhard.
And yet, as the defense pointed out to the jury, Mindy did have reason to want her husband dead.
There was lots of sexual abuse and perversion that the defense was alleging occurred in this family.
In fact, according to Mindy and her family, the three-ways between Mindy, James, and Henry were only the latest in a string of disturbing sexual acts that started back when she was a little girl. Mindy and Henry's relationship had always been unusual, to say the least.
Mr. Dodd had married Mindy's mother when Mindy was only 6 years old.
And according to Mindy, he'd begun sexually abusing her soon after.
She was claiming, sexual abuse as a young child.
And he continued abusing her until he finally impregnated her. It was after that time that Mr. Dodd divorced Mindy's mother and later married Mindy.
In order for her to survive that situation, it's just very adaptive for her to give in to what he tells her to do because it's going to be much safer for her than what she perceives behaving otherwise might be.
And as James had just testified, Mindy wasn't the only minor he'd abused either.
After we were married, I found out later that he had molested some people in his family, and he had molested James.
And the defense claimed that the love triangle between Mindy, Henry, and James had been just as abusive.
While Mindy and James Smallwood did have a sexual relationship, it wasn't consensual. It was actually forced by Mr. Dodd.
The fact that Henry abused James from a very young age, it is likely that that made him very vulnerable for repeated abuse.
And Betty Dodd claimed that Henry had sexually abused her, too, even after their divorce and his marriage to Mindy.
I would go to visit my grandkids, and he would take me into the bedroom and then make me have sex with him.
And Henry hadn't stopped there, according to the defense. They claimed that he had forced Mindy and her mother to violate the ultimate taboo.
To engage in sexual acts with each other.
That was a shock to me, because that's disgusting. That's just sick.
Mindy's mother said they'd had no choice but to comply.
He physically threatened us, and I was so afraid of him, because he was a lot bigger than me. He was 6 foot tall, and just his anger and the way he turned when he got angry, and he would punch holes in the walls.
He knew how to manipulate people and he knew how to control them.
And according to the defense, all the bizarre and twisted abuse he'd subjected the family to over the years meant that Henry bore some responsibility for his own death.
The defense argued that Mr. Dodd had created a situation by which all of these people were just trying to find a way out.
It was just a horrible, horrible situation.
However, as horrible as her situation supposedly was, the defense stopped short of admitting that she had intended for James to kill Henry.
While he had abused her, she also, in some essence, loved him. So it didn't make sense that Mindy wanted to kill her husband. I don't see my mom actually going through with something like that.
But now, on trial for murder, would Mindy be brave enough to take the stand in her own defense? Her attorneys decided not to risk it.
All the information was already out there. The only thing she could do was get deeper and deeper into that hole by testifying for herself.
Although even without Mindy telling the story firsthand, there was still a strong chance that the twisted tale of Henry's many perversions would affect the outcome.
The abuse, physical, mental, sexual, all manner of horrors that she suffered. And the jury certainly would have taken that into account as well.